So in the fall of 1912, CPR started building this grain elevator in Transcona. The elevator would have cost about the equivalent of $3 million today. The structure consisted of a workhouse, a big tall structure where the grain was loaded and unloaded, and then a bin house which had 65 bins and was about 92 feet high. They started loading up this grain elevator in 1913. They loaded it about 3/4 full until anything started to happen. Midday on October 18, 1913, CPR workers from the site were off having lunch when they heard cries that the elevator was collapsing. They all run back to the elevator, and it's already shifted a foot within the first hour, and it doesn't show signs of stopping, so there's not really much they could do to stop this 20,000-ton structure from tilting. And the bridge that connected the elevator to the workhouse had totally fallen down and broken. But the workhouse was actually still standing. The structure continued to sink at a steady pace over the next 12 hours. Engineers were quickly called to the site, but nobody really had any idea how to stop it. And then as the elevator sank, it pushed up the soil underneath it to the side. So there was edges as high as 15 feet that built up along the west side. And that sort of started to brace the elevator as it was falling down. The cupola on top of the bin house crashes to the ground. It sounds like an explosion. People can hear it for miles and miles. At the time they thought that since this huge weight had come off the top of it and this big pile of earth had come to stop it, that's sort of what brought it to a stop. So by the end of it all, the structure had sunk about 24 feet on the west side and had come up about 5 feet on the east side, and that was actually exposing the mat foundation at the bottom of the structure. The structure sat at about an angle of 25 to 27 degrees off center, but the workhouse remained unmoved.
I think there was a lot of heat on the engineers of the day, probably the CP engineers, as to what happened, right? And there were, theories about, underground rivers and everything else. So, I mean, they really didn't know.
There was nothing underneath this thing. It was just ball prairie and this huge big building. They never thought that it would tip over.
They should have loaded it uniformly, and that would have kept the bearing pressure the same all around on the foundation.
Yeah.
But they could have loaded it in stages, which would have made a big difference.
So despite the movement, the structure remained intact with relatively few cracks. And now they're wondering, what do we do? First things first, getting the grain out. They wanted to save this grain. Workers punched holes in the westerly row, so the row that was slanted down. They punched holes along the edges and let the grain bleed out onto conveyors, and then they just shipped that all away. And it actually only took them about 3 weeks to totally empty the elevator. So after that, their priority shifted to the workhouse to make sure that that didn't collapse as well, which was feared initially. So a plan was developed by the foundation company of Montreal and Vancouver to underpin and secure the foundation. That started in late 1913. Eventually, the foundation company convinced CPR that the bin house could also be saved. The structure has sunk 40 feet below prairie level. It's going to be hard. In February of the next year, they actually started digging the dirt and digging the ground, this frozen, frosty ground, to try and dig under the elevator. And their first plan was just to put a pivot here, dig all of this out, and tilt it over. But the problem with that was now the elevator is 40 feet underground. That's not good. So their new plan that they developed was to raise up the structure while straightening it. So they'd start by rotating it around a point at the very far west edge, and they'd rotate it until it got to about 16 degrees. Then they'd switch and they'd rotate it from a new point while lifting the other side with big screws that they would manually sit under and screw up. And that would come from the middle, and that would go into 8 degrees. Then they'd shift to the final point, and they'd raise that up until it was vertical again. It would work. This is a possibility that could fix the structure.
And then when they raised the whole structure and tilted it, they ended up about 12 feet short until where the cupola connects, I guess the conveyor connects up top, right?
Yeah.
So 12 feet short, so as a result, the bottom of the bins would have been buried, so this whole area was dug out around the bins. And all of the work here almost all of it was done by hand, right?
Yeah.
You see some steam-driven equipment, per se, for the conveyor systems or for the pumps, but there was no shovels, steam-powered shovels or anything that I can see. It was all spade work, right? The whole process of of digging underneath and underpinning and straightening it out is marvelous. The effort that was made to get the bin house straightened out is absolutely remarkable.
It is
ingenious. I don't think that would be an overstatement at all. It's very, very ingenious.
So all of that work finished on October 17th, 1914. The structure was vertical again on that day. And it actually continued to function after that. It's still in operation today as well. This is a huge, huge, huge feat for engineering. First, because the structure tipped so much but didn't suffer much damage, and that was remarkable to begin with. Secondly, it's a great example of soil mechanics and the bearing capacity of soil. In the
1940s, the bearing capacity formulas were first developed, and the bearing capacity formula allows us to work out the bearing capacity of the soil. How much weight can you put on the soil? So we could take this case history and work out the theoretical bearing capacity and then compare that to the load at failure. The two numbers are remarkably close. So it was really the first case history that could be used to validate the bearing capacity formula. Just seeing how things were done 100 years ago and what could be done, and how creative they were in terms of coming up with solutions.
The Transcona elevator is still studied to this day by engineers worldwide. It's pretty neat.
It's gathered there's a huge amount of interest from anybody that's in kind of the geotechnical field. Certainly is aware of the Transcona Grain Elevator. They've seen pictures in a textbook or heard stories. Probably one of the most famous case histories of a structure that was built and loaded to failure, which is really what makes it such an interesting and unique case history.